Welcome to the Vietnamese Poetry, Literature channel. Today we will listen to the work, Hungry, by author Thach Lam. Let's listen. A gust of wind woke Sin up. He felt the cold air of winter seep through the thin blanket, and felt tired from curling up on the hard wooden bed all night. Sin rolled up the blanket and sat up. So, like other mornings, a heavy sadness and depression came to oppress the soul. The objects around him were hidden in the dim darkness, making Sin think of his poverty and hardship. A dilapidated small table in the corner of the wall, a bamboo bed with a few broken spokes, a kettle with cotton missing and a few broken cups with yellowish water. Inside, a leather chest, traces remain of the previous prosperous life. All the furniture in the room is just that. But for a long time, Sin still only had those shabby things around him. It had been a long time since he came to this dark, damp room. The days of hunger and cold cannot be counted anymore. The sound of the wind whistling through the door at night was familiar to him, even the feeling of being exhausted from hunger, he had experienced it many times. Sin sighed. He remembered the day he was fired from his job, the decisive and cold voice of his boss, the depressed and disappointed faces of his brothers in the same situation as him. From that moment on, the deprivation and suffering began, until now. The sound of clogs on the sidewalk made Sin wake up and look towards the door. His wife had returned. She lifted the red curtain hanging at the door and entered. Sin briefly saw his wife's body clearly visible on the light background, a thin, ragged body in a thin, loose shirt. That scene made him feel sad. His wife walked next to the bed, quietly looking at Sin without saying anything. Sin took her hand and pulled it down to his side, lovingly asking, "Where are you going so early?" "I went to Mrs. Ba at the end of the street to borrow money." "Is that possible?" Vo Sin looked at her husband, sighed and shook her head. "Who will lend us a loan now? She doesn't even remember when she asked me for help before." Sin was sad and said despondently, "Life's habits are still the same, why blame them?" "But now what?" He thought about the empty rice jar, but there was not a single coin left in his pocket. For 2 days now, he and his wife had eaten their last meal of rice. For 2 days, hunger made him miserable. "How?" His wife repeated that question, then bowed her head and cried. A love flooded into his heart like a strong wave. Sin tightly held his wife's hand in his arms, passionately. He just wanted to die right then and there to avoid the hardship that was so heavy on his shoulders. The afternoon comes and brings cold winds. Sin put his chair on the small porch in front of the room, leaned on the balcony and looked down at the house. The place he rented was a long, narrow house, divided into many rooms. Each room is sheltered by a family, all poor people doing business in different places. This is the time they make dinner. While seeing them busy working, Sin thought about his kitchen, which still had cold ash, and he worried about why his wife had not returned since this morning. Or is it just another disappointment like many times? Thinking about it, Sin felt pity for the woman who had always been used to being a prostitute, but now had to suffer because of him. The two sides met at a drinking party in County Do's neighborhood. At that time, he was still a man with a job and a man with a lot of money. Knowing each other, then falling in love, he did not care about his family's obstacles to marry her. The couple lived happy, loving days together, days that still left in his mind a peaceful memory, that every time he thought about it, he couldn't help but feel nostalgic. Then poverty came, bringing with it hardships, suffering, and cold and hungry days. However, the suffering he felt did not make his wife love him any less. Still as passionate and loving as before, the love between both sides only became more bitter because of their pity for each other. The image of a weak body, a piece of rag printed on the morning sky again flashed before Sin's eyes. He remembered the disappointment of not being able to borrow money, the sad eyes, passionately looking at him as if filled with so much affection, so much sacrifice. A gust of wind made Sin feel cold to the bone. He felt hungry, an extreme hunger like he had never seen in his life. Hunger was like scratching his stomach, making him exhausted, his eyes were dizzy, everything in him was dim as if shaking. When he had enough to eat and enough clothing, he never paid attention to hunger, never thought about it. Now he understands what hunger feels like. He shuddered at the thought of the intensity of hunger, he felt that the need of the body overwhelmed all the laws of the spirit. The smell of cooking food in the yard made him extremely uncomfortable. Sin bowed his head on the balcony and looked down to watch them make dinner. Although the food was ordinary, Sin was surprised that he had never craved those things like he craved them now. The pieces of yellow beans in the pan of fat gradually swelled over the fire, the fried fish began to curl, making him so longing that his whole body shook. Never before had he craved that piece of food as much as now. Before, when he heard stories of people fighting over food, he still smiled disdainfully. He believes that food is an insignificant thing, only the purity of the soul is necessary. But now, in this moment of hunger, he clearly saw the strong need for food. And he, who used to be a wealthy man, when he passed by this group of dirty and poor common people, he still despised and wondered what they lived for, lived to be miserable, to be hungry and cold. I don't know what life means to them. But I'm still passionately attached. Now he wishes he could have a piece of food like them to survive the cold weather. A gentle hand placed on Sin's shoulder turned around. His wife smiled and held out in front of him several shiny, neat and clean paper packages, which he glanced at and Sin immediately recognized as edible food. It's very delicious, only available in Western stores. The smell of marinated meat and sausage wafted past. Sin's hands shook as he untied the ropes around him. He happily asked, "Oh, where is this? Where did Mai get the money to buy that?" Mai heard Sin ask. "Just eat. Eat until you're hungry, then tell me the story. It's so lucky, and she's so blessed, bro." "Who is that? Tell me about it." Mai looked lovingly at her husband. "No, just eat it first. While eating, I will talk." Then she quickly placed the paper packages on the table and opened the wrapping paper. Sin saw a few pieces of rosy marinated meat, white and clear fat like glass, a few smooth lean pork rolls, a few golden and red Western cakes. Mai spoke happily. "Well, if you stay home, you're taking a risk, but you really don't know who to turn to for help. He is no stranger to his friends now. When they see that they are poor, no one will help them, because there is no way they can repay them. That's why I wandered around the streets, thinking that at that time we were so close, brother, I just wanted to dive into the river for free. Luckily, at that moment, I met Mrs. Yu, someone I knew from before. She saw me and hurriedly asked questions like someone who caught something." Mai spoke quickly and fluently. "She's so kind. She lent me money, and even promised to help me fund my business. Then tomorrow, I will go to sell areca nuts, okay? It's amazing that there is a woman who knows how to love people like that. Born happily. Otherwise we will have to fast today. But why did you buy it like this?" Mai bowed her head and smiled, her cheeks were red, and her hair was tangled on her forehead, adding to her charm. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a stack of bills, threw them in front of Sin, then quickly and happily entered the house. "Please wait a moment, I'll go get a knife to cut the cake." She turned away and Sin suddenly saw a folded piece of paper falling to the ground. He accidentally bent down, picked it up, opened it and read. "Never me. Here, I'll give you the money I promised. If you want more, I'll give them to you, but you have to be there on time tonight, I'll wait." The piece of paper in Sin's hand fell without him knowing. A heavy weight seemed to press down on his heart, causing him to stop breathing. It seemed that in one moment, all the happy hopes of his life were gone. Living thought can die right at that moment. The pain he felt was profound and profound. What else do you hope for is something unreal, just another dream. There is no longer any doubt, that amount of money is the amount of money inside this letter. Who can lend? Sin remembered the days when he went to ask for money, the times he returned disappointed and sad, the earnest and resentful words his wife recounted, and the indifference of the people she knew. Who is Mrs. Yu? It's just a fabrication to cover his eyes. Sin felt anger rising strongly in his heart, his lips naturally curled up in contempt. He trembled and whispered softly. You bastard. My heart feels like it's been stabbed by a needle. Sin tightly grabbed the edge of the chair, looked at the roll of paper on the table, looked at the half-opened food package, then bent down to pick up the folded paper. For a moment, silence. Then Sin clearly heard the sound of the cloth curtain at the door being squeezed in the wind, the sound of slippers gently walking, approaching him. Sin tried his best to bite his lips to suppress the anger boiling in his heart, holding his hands tighter, so as not to shake my whole body. His hand gently stroked Sin's hair, his wife stood right next to him. She unfolded the paper, took a knife to cut the cake, and happily said, Do you think this cake is delicious? I bought it at Trong store there. This piece of marinated meat is the best, I had to pay 5 cents, bro. Let me cut it for you. It seems like you're very hungry. Me too. Well, let's eat until we're full, then we'll talk later. She finished cutting the marinated meat, placed it on a plate, and continued smiling. Hey, will you eat? How lucky for us. If you don't meet Mrs. Yu today, I wonder what we will do. She patted Sin's shoulder and shook her husband. How? Resisting like every other day, what else can I do, Mr. Sin? You should thank her. She is truly a good, gentle person who loves people. As soon as I opened my mouth to ask, she took out the statue's intestines and immediately gave me 15 coins in total, sir. Haven't you counted the roll of banknotes yet? I won't lie to you. Sin's anger reached its peak, he couldn't hold it in anymore. The name Mrs. Yu made him frustrated, because he clearly understood his wife's lies, cleverly and naturally lying like the truth. Will it ever be like that again? Those clear eyes, such a gentle face, I didn't expect to be able to hide such darkness as now. With a strong swing of his arm, Sin threw Mai away like someone would throw a terrifying animal. Mai staggered back and fell against the wall, her scarf flapping and her hair falling out. She opened her eyes wide and looked at her husband in surprise. Oh great! What are you doing? Sin laughed, his teeth hissing, a terrible laugh like the laughter of a madman. How? You even asked me why. Well, stop pretending, don't lie anymore. Sin opened his hand and held out a crumpled piece of folded paper. So what kind of paper is this? Mai saw her face turn gray, her hands clasped her head, her body trembling. Sin's voice became even more mocking, ironic, and bitter. Mrs. Yu is kind. Wow. She's kind, she loves people, she's gentle. Why don't you say, she promised to come again tonight? Mai bowed her head and covered her face, sobbing. That cry did not make Sin's anger subside, it only increased it like a fire fueled by fuel. The more Sin spoke, the more anger he felt boiling up in his heart. Mai, afraid, crouched against the wall, sobbing, hesitantly, softly calling. Mr. Sin, I. Born as if he didn't hear the sound, he kept saying. Why are you crying anymore? Go now, get out of this house, I don't want to see your face for another minute. You take this. Sin raised his hand to grab a roll of banknotes from the table and threw it at Mai. The banknotes were thrown out and scattered on the steps. He threw several food packages to the ground, pieces of cake and pieces of meat splashed under the table. No one wants to eat these damn things. Then he tiredly leaned back on the chair, his hands clasped around his forehead, not paying attention to Mai, who was fearfully raising her hand towards him, pleading and begging. Then she sobbed, pulled her shirt to cover her face, and went outside. Sin bowed his head and thought, the anger has dissipated, leaving behind an extremely sad and depressed feeling. Sin felt cold in his heart, a cold feeling that tightened his gut. Thinking of the past days of hunger and suffering, of the years of living in poverty, Sin felt angry and resentful of his fate. But why yet another pain? Why did Mai have to suffer so many times with him in the past, and now she sold herself for a few silver coins? Why did Mai do such a miserable thing like now? So much pain in his heart made Sin sobbing and choking. His heart could not contain the pain. Sin collapsed on the table. A cold wind blew, making him shiver. Suddenly his whole body moved. He just caught a glimpse of the fragrant and fatty scent of the pieces of marinated meat still stuck to his hands. The hunger boiled again, like clawing at the intestines, tearing at the liver, intense, even worse than sadness. He wanted to resist, wanted to forget, but he couldn't. The feeling of hunger had spread throughout his body like a tide pouring onto the sand. Every time the wind blew, every time he smelled the greasy scent of marinated meat, the aroma of yellow cake, Sin's nose naturally expanded, inhaled sharply. The aroma penetrated his intestines and liver, as if it had penetrated into his bones. Marrow. Sin bent down to look at the food package scattered under the table. He glanced around several times, but didn't see Mai standing there anymore. Gently raising his hand as if hesitant and afraid, Sin grabbed the rosy piece of meat. Sin ate in a hurry, didn't have time to chew or swallow. He held the piece of meat tightly in his hand, slimy and greasy, without thinking, always putting it in his mouth. In the paper package, the food was gone, only small crumbs stuck to the greasy paper surface. Sin felt a burning sensation in his stomach. He leaned back and sighed comfortably. But he remembered the letter, the banknote, remembered Mai's sobbing voice nestled against the wall, remembered the contemptuous, ironic, and bitter words. He remembered his frustration and pain. An immense depression filled my whole body. Sin covered his face with both hands, bowed his head and sobbed. At the end of the work, please support me with the like button and subscribe to the channel to listen to more works.